on this computer.
Hi everyone, it's Whit Taylor, cartoonist and editor, and I'm here with Ryan Alexander Tanner, also cartoonist, and we're going to talk about your new book and your Kickstarter for Muhammad Ali. How does that
That's,
sound, Ryan?
I sounds like that's what we came here to do. Thanks for being here, Whit.
Yeah, of course. It's always nice to chat with you. Do you have your book with you? You want to show it off?
You know what? It's not
I mean, your
it's not printed. I mean, I have the single issues in
that's what
print.
I
I
meant.
wish I'd
Yeah.
thought of that. So good start to not have the book.
It's okay. Maybe you can edit that in. But yeah. So I'm trying to remember when we first started working together on the Muhammad Ali project. Was it before the pandemic started? Do you
I think it
think?
was like 2016 or something. Yeah, it's
Oh my,
2017. It was a
it's
long, many moons ago. Yeah.
been a minute. All right. Okay. Now I'm going back and remembering. So yeah, we got connected to work together, and we talked a little bit about the project. And I'm just curious. Like, can you tell us a little bit about why Muhammad Ali, like why this was the project that you kind of wanted to focus on.
Yeah, I would say way back when I started working on this, I had aspirations about a comics biography. Just I wanted to see it done a certain way, which was not using captions really, just putting you in the moment and kind of recreating, almost like a biopic, but accurate, not sacrificing accuracy for drama because it has to be 2 hours long. So that
Right.
was my initial idea, and then Muhammad Ali occurred to me as a subject. I think initially because he refused to fight in the Vietnam War. And that to me still is his kind of greatest legacy. And
Hmm.
that's what got me interested in him as a subject. And then on top of that, boxing works so well in comics, like the visual, the thing he did. There's a lot of interesting musicians with interesting stories, but the thing they do translates so poorly to comics that boxing really appealed to me. And so those two things together basically got me to buy a book about him, which was my first book was David Remnick's King of the World, which is about his
Hmm.
early years. And I read that. And then just the more I read about him, the more interested. I mean, I'm working on this thing for 10 years and I still think Muhammad Ali is fascinating. So,
I
uh,
think that's the right attitude to have. I think sometimes the more you learn about something, the more you realize that there's way more to learn, you know?
mhm.
And I think that's a good approach to scholarship. So,
Yeah, and I think as a comics artist, like it's pretty easy to fizzle out on something through the process. Sometimes you write it and then you're over it, or
mhm,
like, I don't want to draw this, so it was helpful to know it was a good story as I was
sure.
working on it to go, like, regardless of how I do, this is a great and important story. This is part of our history that people should know about. So it was very motivating to keep working on for a million years.
Right, right. And also, I think it's important to choose things that you want to draw, things that are enjoyable to draw. So, I mean, it comes across like through your art that you like drawing action scenes and
Mm.
sports and things like that. So, um, another reason why you should all back the Kickstarter because the action in the story is like phenomenal in my opinion. But
Well, thank you.
just yeah. So once you decided you were gonna do this, you read this biography, and what was the next step after that?
Yeah, well, I read the biography in like 2010 or something, and I just had this idea in the back of my head. So I think it was 5 or so years later that I really committed to it. And then I just spent like 2 years just reading. I read a huge stack of biographies, basically whatever I could find, which is there's no shortage biographies about Muhammad Ali and watching documentaries. So I spent about 2 years where I had, I think 50 pages a day was the goal. So I'd read at least 50 pages a day and then just take notes. I have like notebooks and notebooks. And then I had this big poster that was just like a chart. And it was, you probably know this, we have a thing in common of just doing research and turning into comics. I
Hmm.
think more than anything, why I made this, and you probably relate, is like having a brain that gets some sort of stimulation from like gathering information and reorganizing it into comics and
Yeah,
figuring out how to make it into sequences.
absolutely.
Um, Yeah, so it was a lot of that was like lists, and then I'm always like, what do we need? What do you want people to know? Is always the thrust of the whole thing.
That's the
So then
big question.
figuring out, yeah, how do we organize it into chapters? How many chapters? What information's in each chapter? So I just spent a long time, and then I wrote three drafts or something, I think, before I finally created a draft that I shared with you, and then edits, and
Mhm.
then drawing it, which just takes forever.
Yeah. And we had worked on a project before, another editing project, or maybe I'm trying to remember if that was like Holler if you hear me.
That was after we, that was something I was working on. I actually took a break in this. I took many
That's right.
breaks to do other stuff in this project. And
Right.
then I was working on Holler If You Hear Me for Teachers College Press. And then I
Mhm.
recommended you as the editor, and that worked out, right? You were, yeah, you're the
Yeah,
editor of the
yeah.
book.
No,
That was sort
that's now it's okay. So yeah, when I remember seeing your scripts for the first time, and I was just impressed by your thoroughness, like your documentation, all the notes that you had, and yeah, I feel like sometimes cartoonists can be a little obsessive, a little, I don't know, especially with nonfiction. I feel like it's a certain type that's driven to categorizing and organizing and trying to figure out how to communicate ideas from your head to another person. And I think that you were very committed to making sure all the information was like accurate, the time periods. It's like it's there is a lot of attention to detail, and I think that readers will see that when they start to, when they receive your copies. But did you have any hesitations like diving into it? Because I mean, again, when you started working on it, the comics industry was in a very different place than it is even now.
Yeah.
So things kind of shift depending on a variety of factors. But were there any hesitations going into it? Any things that you were like kind of thinking about while you were starting to approach this topic?
What sort of hesitations?
Like, well, because he's a very popular figure. He's a very well known figure, and like as somebody, I did a comics biography on Harriet Tubman
Mhm.
with Casimir Lee who drew it, and like one of my hesitations was like trying to make another biography of a character or of a person who's so well known and is almost
Mhm.
like there's a lot of mythology around her, and I
Mhm.
was worried about how I would do it justice. Did you have any hesitations about that, or did you think about how yours would be different from other biographies?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot, and there's not a comprehensive biography about Muhammad Ali in comics. There's
Mm,
not even a good one, if I'm allowed to say that. Like, there's some that are really focused on a moment, which is true of documentaries too. Like, there's a really good one about the rumble in the jungle, and there's a really good one about his legal problems. But it's such a big story that to get it all in one, there's some like 6 hour documentaries that are the whole story because it's that long. And then in comics, there's nothing that tries to tell the whole story really. Like I have for my kid, there's like a 12-page children's book that sort of summarizes his story, but
mhm.
nothing that really is about what it's about, like
Right.
here's what this means and here's really the whole, because I mean, I wanted this book to be a lot shorter than it is, but it's just you can't do it
Yeah.
because it's so expansive, it's like 30 years of really intense events and a lot of things that lead into other things or parallels, a lot of heavy concepts to get into. So I saw it as something that I've always felt like the best projects is where you go, I would really like to read that or watch that or experience that as a thing, and it doesn't exist. To me, that
Right.
always is like a call to make a good, and then it's a big responsibility. There's also a billion sources on Muhammad Ali, so I didn't feel I had an aspiration to make the best source in comics and to make something that sort of the initial thing before it was even about Muhammad Ali, when it's just a biography, was I wanted like a kid in middle school to be able to read this comics biography and get as much out of it as they would in a written biography. Like that was my like thing, that I wanted it to have as much substance and information. And I think I achieved that.
Hmm.
Um,
I agree.
Thanks. Yeah. And then there's so much stuff about Muhammad Ali that I don't feel like I would be the single voice of who he was And as you read all these biographies, you see all this cross-referencing, and you really see how the story has been put together kind of communally over a long
Right.
time. So the story is really written. It's really just how you tell the story. And then I put a lot of pressure on myself to tell the story right. And I did a
Right.
lot of research not just being like reading books, but talking with people.
Hmm.
I would say the most complex thing was how to talk about the Nation of Islam and really
Yeah, I was actually going to
understand.
ask you about that because I remember when we were like discussing that, you were very mindful of like how you were gonna, tell that story. So yeah, go ahead.
Just, I mean, I had kind of a light going off moment. Well, so there are Nation of Islam's always written about unfavorably, pretty much always, and they're, as an organization, they're a flawed organization, is one way to put it.
Mhm.
But they're a religious organization, and to me, it was really crucial to say, what did this mean to Muhammad Ali? What did this organization do for him as a person and for his career? And I think that's really important. And then, I mean, I think cultural bias is a huge subject of this work in general, having to examine how he was seen in the 60s and then et cetera, et cetera. But part of seeing that was looking at how the Nation of Islam was always written about,
Mhm.
like their theology was always written about really critically. And I talked to a guy who was the editor of Muhammad Speaks, the Nation of Islam's newspaper for a bunch of years. And I asked him, I said, "Oh, did you really think that the Earth was 66 trillion years old and all these theological kind of things that are balked at about the Nation of Islam?" And he said, "Well, those are allegorical narratives, and
Right.
some people took them literally, and some people just took the meaning of it. What is this meaning? What is this telling people?" And I was like, "Oh, right. That's true of the Bible.
Right.
If you read a biography about John F. Kennedy, you wouldn't go, 'Oh, he followed this religion and he thought the earth was 6,000 years old and we all came from the Garden of Eden.' It's kind of
Mhm.
condescending. It's not kind
Right.
of, it's condescending to write about anyone's theology in such a way, I think. So that was very helpful to me, just that lens of, and I'm agnostic. I don't subscribe to any religion, so it's a little maybe easier for me to equate one religion with another and say their theologies are maybe equally valid or equally ridiculous. So that was important. And just to see what they had done for Muhammad Ali and also just the messiness and the complexity of all of this, I think is important. And not to, I think you and I worked well together because when I read your work before we ever worked together, I really felt like you were not telling the audience what to think or
Mhm.
what to believe. You had work about your own experiences and there was ambiguity. There was sort of like, here's how I recorded this, and you can sort of interpret it yourself. And that to me is so valuable. And I have strong opinions about this material, but I really tried to just present it in that way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Generally, when I'm doing that sort of work, I don't feel like it's my place to like insert necessarily my opinion, but to try to tell the story as best as I can, and to try to show that a lot of stories have complexity to them. And yeah, I mean, I'm agnostic too, so I think my approach is similar, where it felt more like a comparative religion approach, when you're discussing it. And another issue that I know, like we talked about too, was stuff around race and like so like who gets to tell what stories, who gets to use what language, stuff like that. Um, so yeah, you're a white guy. You're telling a story about a historical black character figure, and I'm sure like you asked me like how I felt about working with you on this and some of my opinions, and like again, I feel like you approach to this topic with great curiosity, great respect, and you talk to um, lots of lots of people. Like you talk to lots of scholars, and you listened and you learned. And I really liked your approach. That's another reason why I liked working with you on this book. Is like I felt like I could have these conversations, which is not always possible when you're talking about things that are kind of like tricky.
Mhm.
So did that come up at all? Like did you have any issues around, your ability, your right to tell this story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's really important thing to examine. And I think, before we say anything, is just to say that's an issue because we live in a deeply racist society, and there's a history of white supremacy and racism that really drives this country, and that white exploitation of black people and their stories and their experiences is a huge built-in issue. So that's why it comes up. And then the experience I had, I think, is fairly unique, because the reason it was an issue to me, I'd say professionally, was because the publishing industry is still very much run by white people. And as I was working on this book, white people became very apprehensive about paying white people to do work about people of color. This sort of, I don't know if you'd call it
Mhm.
a mandate, went out. And I think there's validity there. And I also think that if you are a publisher, you should have the ability to discern if the material is working well.
Right.
So I feel like if you're an editor at a publisher and you can't discern for yourself whether or not a white person did a good job writing about a person of color, then maybe we should get a person of color to do that job. I sort of feel like I mean, I think we're talking about systemic problems when we talk
Right.
about representation in publishing. I think a project like this, we should look at the content. I think a white person can tell a good story about people of color, and I think a black person potentially could make a bad book about people of color. That could happen, and that who decides who gets to tell these stories is really messy. I don't think we've really figured that out. But
Yeah.
I think that what I feel like I've seen is a white-run publishing industry, everyone keeping their jobs by kind of playing it safe. And I don't know. I mean, that's me maybe deferring blame. I think it's a big responsibility, and I think telling anyone's life story is a big
Hmm.
responsibility. Understanding the nuance of it, their circumstance. Um, I believe I've done the work, and in sharing this work for years and doing a lot of peer review and things like that, I will say that all the pushback I've gotten has been from white people, like 100% of it.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about some of those issues, like especially around like, what language can be used, things like
hmm,
that. And like in my opinion, I feel like when you're doing like this is a biography of a historical figure.
mhm.
And I felt like if you hadn't done any due diligence like around issues of race, I feel like that would have been an issue. But I do feel like you approach this with like understanding, what was at stake and what your responsibilities were and doing and like and writing about a person of color. And so I didn't see a problem with it. And like I have opinions about the comics industry. I've had my own experiences as a black woman in the comics industry. It's
Mhm.
complicated, and that's probably a whole another like discussion. But I was just curious
No, I mean,
to
it's
talk
important
to you
to
about that.
address.
So
It's the elephant in the room. I want to say a couple other things too. Like, in terms of language, like, I'm not from the South and I wasn't alive in the 50s and 60s. So I was comfortable with admitting that, I mean, there's a ton of recorded and written interviews with Muhammad Ali, so you can get a sense of how he talks. Um, but in terms of like phrases used in the 50s and things, so I just worked with a language specialist. I found a guy at the University of Kentucky who agreed to basically proofread this and do a little, oh, they wouldn't say that, they would say this, So I
mhm,
just understood that I wasn't an expert. I needed some help. So that's
yeah,
important too, as is, having an
absolutely,
editor, having someone read your work and tell you. Um,
absolutely,
and then in terms of I mean, it's messy to say too, but like I grew up in really diverse environments, and I think people see a white guy saying that and it's kind of an eye rolly thing to say maybe, but um where I learned American history, it wasn't very white centered, you know, it wasn't really taught to me by white people mostly. So, I mean, I think I didn't learn about racial disparity at a liberal arts college.
Right,
I
right,
learned it because I saw it, because
right, right.
I grew up in a neighborhood where the police don't come when you call them, or street repairs
Hmm.
don't happen, and things like that. I've seen it. I've seen conflicts happen in front of me, and you know, if a white person and a black person are in conflict and the police come, I've seen who gets treated how. Like I saw it
Right.
growing up. So it's not a new concept to me, these things we're talking about. Um,
Yeah.
Obviously, it's the way we talk about it, it's always changing. There's always more to learn about it. Also, Muhammad Ali is someone who liked being famous and liked his story being told,
Hmm.
and who lived very publicly. So, like, his second marriage breaks up in a hotel room in this very dramatic moment, and there's reporters in the room. You can tell someone exactly what happened because two guys were sitting there and documented it. So, there's he kind of made his life be documented. He's like the
Hmm.
pre-reality TV most documented person, you know, where
True.
there's so much material. So there's not a lot of like interpreting or it's all out
Well,
there. So, you know.
and speaking of that, like you're saying, there's like so much material. How did you decide? How did you go about deciding what were the things you wanted to really feature? Because obviously you can't include everything.
Mhm.
Um, how did you like, based off of what you read and like your research process, how did you narrow down like how you wanted to tell the story?
Yeah, I think it came from that bullet point, you know, and a lot of things were contextual too. Like, what can you communicate in a scene, you know?
Hmm.
Sometimes something would be interesting to me, but it would take, oh, it's going to take 4 pages to tell this story. Like there's those really famous photos of him training underwater,
Hmm.
which works really well. And the third chapter is kind of all about him crafting his public persona. And that
Hmm.
story is kind of a good example of that. And
Hmm.
you know, he basically tricked I think a Life magazine reporter into believing that he trained underwater, and they did a photo shoot around it, but it was all he just made it up to get into Life magazine. Which
Did
is
his
just,
own PR.
sorry?
That's he said he did his own PR.
Yeah, he was a PR genius, like an
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
genius of PR. But when I started working on that story, I go, oh, this is at least 6 pages long, and it's not telling you anything you don't already know in this. The point of this chapter is like, look at what a PR genius he is, basically.
Right.
So that adds to that, but not enough that it can take up that much. So it's a lot of prioritizing.
Right. And
And then,
that's hard. Like, I mean, I find this as a cartoonist and an editor, sometimes the things that are like you most want to include because they're fun or just interesting, like often those are the things that you have to not be too precious about them because if it doesn't serve the story, then it doesn't necessarily need to be in there. So
I
that
think
is one of the trickier parts.
I think the very first thing I learned doing nonfiction comics was that if you go in with the narrative in your head, it's going to get in the way.
Hmm.
Like that you really need to be open to the material and learn about it and share what you learned. Share what you learned, but also really figure out what does the audience need to know and what are our priorities within the amount of space we have. I think those are like the crucial lessons. So
Yeah.
I came in with, you know, 15 years of nonfiction comics experience. So that
Hmm.
was part of it too, is just kind of building up to I want to ask you something though, too, in terms of we're talking about representation, and this isn't to turn it around, but I think it's to kind of look at a point too. Like when I was starting to look for an editor, I got, I would say, social pressure to find a black person to be the editor. Um, and I both saw the point of that, and it was seemed really awkward to me, like to go like, "Hey, you're a black person, will you edit?" You know, like that too is there's trouble there too. And I want to ask your opinion about that, but I also would say that before I got in touch with you, because we were both involved with the nib,
Hmm.
um, so we had people in common. So you recommended multiple times. but I read some interviews with you and I read some of your comics. And to me, why I reached out to you instead of someone else of candidates was we had a lot of the same influences. I read
Mhm.
we basically both seem like we came from like 90s indie comics. Like you're talking
Mhm.
about Peter Bag's work in interviews, and I read your stuff and like doing kind of three-tiered kind of grid-based things and
Yep.
having more ambiguity in the work. So that to me said made me go, "Oh, I want to work with this person." But I just am curious, like your thoughts on that. Like, oh, a person of color should edit a book about a person of color or make a book or how that feels to you to be
Um,
kind of approached that way.
I don't think it's like, I mean, I think it's more complicated than just like um any person of color will be is the right fit for editing any book that involves people of color. Like I think
Yeah.
there has to be you know, the right interest. Like the editor has to have interest in doing it. Like are they familiar with like the genre of comics? Like, you know, there's a lot. It's not just like your um your race doesn't automatically mean that that's the right fit. But I do think there are some lived experiences, and there's things that come from living as a person of color, like especially in the United States, where like you do have certain insights to things.
Hmm.
And I think that can be valuable too. But like you said, in my case, like you decided to work with me because like in terms of actual comics and cartooning, we had a lot in common. So I think
Mhm.
that's valuable too. And it's like, you know, I've been in comics for a while. Like I remember going to like some of my first shows in the like what mid late 2000s. And like I was one of like a handful of black people at those shows. Like
Mhm.
we all knew each other. There was only a few of us, and like the vibe was very different. There was a lot less women, a lot less, you know, queer people. It was a very different vibe. And sometimes I got treated accordingly as a result. Like yes, I was new too, and I was still developing, you know, still developing as a cartoonist. And learning how to exist in that industry. But there, I definitely got pigeonholed. I get told like, oh, we'll solicit your work on like, you know, Black History Month, or
Mhm.
you're too. This is like, you know, I often got the thing like your work is too niche. Like people can't identify with the protagonist, for instance, like things like that that like a lot of people don't think about. Whereas like people of color grow up reading white books or people books by white authors all
Yeah.
the time. That doesn't, or watching movies, like consuming media, and then we're not necessarily like, oh well, I can't identify with that person, so I'm not gonna take a chance on it. Like that's just how society is as presently.
Mhm.
So I think that there's things that like people. I think there are new perspectives and things that people from different backgrounds can bring, but it's not like it's not cut and dry because it never is, you know. Um,
Yeah, I
so
think there's a
yeah.
piece here. I think to me, like this work is about examining the whole person, or like if you're working with someone, not going like, oh, I need to work with a black person, you're a black person, is going like, who is this person? What's their experience? What are they bringing to this? What am I bringing to this? Thinking it's like pushing a button, I think is also problematic, just going
And
like,
that could be the same problem with in publishing, like you mentioned, like how, for instance, because you're a white author, a lot of folks might have automatically written you off for writing this instead
"Mm,
of realizing, like, oh, you're a nonfiction cartoonist, you are interested in telling this type of story, like, you know, you have this background, these experiences. So people like to simplify things, but it's not simple, you know.
I also think there's this thing about experience. I mean, like this book is very much like a review of different kinds of systemic prejudice. Muhammad Ali kind of experienced a lot of different forms of it, some really overt and some more nuanced. So we can say that when we talk about lived experience, but like you and me both, we don't know what it's like to be Muhammad Ali. We're not athletes or famous, or we weren't alive during
And
the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, so I don't know. It's nuanced. I think that's another thing too. You said something that I've quoted a million times in a discussion about like how we talk about R. Crumb now. And
mhm,
you said both of these things are true. And
mhm,
that's become like a mantra to me of like so many times when we talk about these issues we're having, it's like you have two things that are true and they're in conflict with each other and they're both true. There's these
Yeah,
different lenses you can view this from. And I think trying to do that to sort of just be open to those multiple perspectives is so valuable. And I think that's the thing we really see eye to eye on.
absolutely.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's why, I've enjoyed working on this project. Do you want to talk a little bit about your process? Like,
Sure.
how do you make your comics? Like,
Mhm.
after you have the script done, what does it look like? Do you thumbnail while you're writing your script? Like, what is how do you do it?
Yeah, well, I sent you the script, which is basically like getting all the, it's the same layout, it's like it's a very quickly drawn version of the whole thing. It like looks the same, except people are just like circles. And so then I have a million like files of I have files for like each chapter and then each page of like I mean that's what was really a horrible experience about this is like oh they're in a casino, what does a casino look like in 1963, and they're on the phone, what does
Yeah.
a phone look like, and what does a car look like, and what does downtown Miami look like. So
Can I say something about that too?
yeah.
Another thing I want to mention is I feel like in often writers, people who write comics, get more credit for the work than artists. And like you're doing both in this case,
Mm.
but it takes an incredible amount of research to draw stuff as well. And I think that yeah, I think that illustrators, artists should get much more credit for that than they're given.
Yeah,
Anyhow,
let's
continue.
make that happen. Yeah, credit. Well, and I would say the illustrator, is so unhappy with me, the writer, when I work on this, because it's like, oh man, there's another crowd scene.
Right.
And it's all real people. So anyway, I'm now penciling in Procreate, like on the tablet. I think I got you.
I do it
Yeah,
too.
I've converted many people to drawing and penciling and Procreate on the iPad. And then I print it out on Bristol and I ink it by hand because there's something about inking on paper that cannot be that experience that's my favorite part
Different.
of the whole thing. Um, and then I scan it again and then add the gray tones and it's all hand lettered too, which is like, I'm really holding on to this hand lettering thing, but
I'm like,
it's
that's a dying art, unfortunately.
but I think it looks so much better hand lettering. Like I
I
can,
agree.
yeah, I can see digital lettering in 1 second. Go, oh, that's digital letter. It's easier to fix if you make a mistake or if you change a phrase, but it doesn't look as good. So
There's
that's
less variation in the letters. Like it's just not as interesting.
yeah,
It's
and
not
it's
as fitted to, you know, yeah, it's not necessarily like as adapted to the story, or as adaptable.
yeah, because I think yes, the lettering is expressive. I think the lettering is part of the image.
Mhm.
And when it's digital, it doesn't. It looks more like something that's just stuck on there. I don't love it. So and I mean, this is drawing real people all the time in every panel. It's really hard. This is like
Mhm.
too hard to draw this thing, but it
What's
just
your favorite thing to draw? Like, what if you could draw? Like, what do you feel the most confident drawing?
like in the world.
People, buildings, like, is there something that you tend to gravitate towards?
Yeah, I mean, I always just drew people for sure. I have noticed that, and although I've become more of a like a backgrounds guy, I really went deep on the backgrounds. And when I look at the final drawings, I feel like the backgrounds come out better than the people a little bit. And I really think about the page and the composition now. I've sort of gone through different phases as an artist.
Hmm.
And I really, where my head is at now is just like the placement of all the thing. I feel most confident in that I like put everything where it should go, the word balloons and the characters in the backgrounds.
Hmm.
But it all is a struggle right now. I don't know. I feel like I'm enjoying it more than ever, but I'm also the most kind of self-critical or struggling the most right now.
Well, like I've heard about those, like, when you're still, skill building throughout your career, you have those periods where like your perception of your art is different than your skill level, and those are sometimes when you have the most conflict and you're the most hard on yourself, and then sometimes and then that kind of the gap closes and it can open again, and like that is an upward trajectory ideally. So I feel like if you're feeling critical about it, that's maybe because you're on the verge of like leveling up. I don't know. Just
I hope so. Yeah, no, definitely when I look at these, I mean, I think this is the best I could do. And I just see everything I wish was different when I look at the pages, which I shouldn't tell the audience. This is perfect
I
art. And
mean,
look, yeah.
I think most cartoonists feel that way,
I
you
think
know.
that when you stop feeling that way, you're in trouble, is I think.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Agreed. Um, let's see. Um, I'm just trying to think of what's your what's your favorite part of the book? Like, what was the most fun to draw? Yeah.
I mean, it's not fun to draw because Muhammad Ali is hard to draw. He's got this really angular face, but with really rounded edges, and it's sort of paradoxical. It makes it, if you look to it, any illustrated representation of Muhammad Ali, he's like clearly hard to draw. And
Hmm.
I've done a lot of portraiture too, historically, and he's like the hardest person to draw I've ever drawn.
Hmm.
And I think too, if you want to get artsy fartsy. There's something about his essence. He's sort of more than a person to me, like he's big, like he's a big subject and he's a larger than life person. And there's something about that, like the spirit contained within his body is hard to capture visually. I do have a belief around that. Um, there were some scenes that really, for me, did a certain. The third chapter, which is like when he really becomes this public figure, to me, I always say that that's like, if this was about Batman, that would be the part of the story where he starts dressing like Batman and fighting crime.
Hmm.
Um, where he kind of develops his persona. And there's a page where I had heard this story. I kind of think when I heard the story was the start of this whole project. I was at like a
Hmm.
book event or something, and someone told a story about how there was a newspaper strike before one of his fights, and he had to do all his own promotion. And he went to like a beat poetry reading in Greenwich Village. And, he's doing poetry then. This is like a really hip, this was like the cool kind of counterculture thing that was happening. And then he just went on stage and told like a rhyming poem about how he was going to beat this guy up. And that is so funny to me. Like there's just something so compelling about that story. And also that it's so smart and so absurd and so funny all at the same time, and that he really also represented this of the now thing. Like he meets the Beatles, and it's sort of like these are two elements, the Beatles and Muhammad Ali, that are like defining this moment, and they're both right at the moment they're becoming big. And that he didn't necessarily fit in with popular culture. He defined popular culture.
Right, right.
So him doing this beat poetry reading, I feel like kind of touches that button too. Anyway, I got that done on a page, and that's one of the pages when I look at when I'm like, I envisioned this at the very beginning of this, or even the end of the first chapter. That's a scene that's in David Remnick's book.
Hmm.
And it's so rare, I think, that at the very, very beginning of the thing, you go, oh, I'm going to put this scene in. It'll be the end of the first chapter. That never makes it to the end. It always changes so much by then, but he wins his first sparring match when he's 10 or 12 or something. And then he's like, yeah, he like just gets into this big kind of boasting thing. And you see how he's really empowered and activated by boxing. Like
Hmm.
that was this thing that he found for himself to really transcend. And that ended up still being the final scene of the first chapter. And that was really satisfying for me to see. And then there's a montage in the third chapter of when he starts uh, saying which round he'll win the fight at press conferences. He has like a rhyme of like when he'll win the fight, and then he actually does it. And he did
Hmm.
a series of those in a row, and it's sort of like him at these press conferences and the press being really doubtful, and then him actually doing it, and it's like these
Hmm.
quick transitions. But that is a sequence I was really happy with, where it really
Yeah,
looked how I wanted it to look.
yeah. I mean, I feel like you're one of the more, um, let's see, detail oriented cartoonists I've worked with. Like you're very, like very, I'm gonna use the word obsessive a little bit. I don't mean that as a put down because
No.
like I think it's just true, but I think that works in your favor. Like this is really well documented, and not only that, but it's just like it's a fun read and it's fun. I love the boxing scenes especially because they're just you draw action very well. Like it's just it's fun. And by the way, I'm not trying to like kiss your ass or anything, but like my dad, like he loves your comic, and like
Oh,
whenever a new mini's come out, he's like, ah, I was like, I have one for you. He's like, oh, I can't wait to catch up on this.
oh,
He's
that's
one of those
great.
guys when I was younger who would tell me about how cool like Muhammad Ali was back in the day, and like how much he loved watching him on TV and like civil rights movement, and all this stuff, and like I mean he loves Muhammad Ali, and so I think he thinks that his story has been really captured well by you. So I just wanted to
Oh,
let you know that.
that's awesome. Thank
Got
you
one
for.
of the old heads who's like saying like it's good stuff. So how's the reception been in general with your with the comics that you've released?
It's been really positive. I mean, people who have actually read it, the reception's been really extremely positive. Like I've had a lot of peers. I've had people in, I mean, I don't know what to say about like how this book has done. You know, it's a Kickstarter campaign, but it's definitely kind of opened doors for me. I'm doing a bunch of other work now that I've gotten because I've shared this work and,
That's cool.
gotten writers who will work with me because they've seen this book and things like that. And just that response has been pretty common of people going like, "Oh, you really got it." I mean, I talked with Jonathan Eig, who wrote the last long form comics, not comics biography, standard text biography about Muhammad Ali,
Mhm.
and he was really like, "Oh man, like it's all in there," you know. That was a big kind of moment for me, was sitting down with him and comparing notes and going like, "Oh, I've done a comparable amount of research to this guy who wrote a 600-page book," you know.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I think people that are really engaging with it have had it seems to be serving its function, which is was the dream. I wanted to say one other thing too, like about the fight scenes. So we talked about kind of coming from similar traditions of like indie comics and visual storytelling wise, one thing I did was like most of the time it's like grid based kind of indie comics, standard. And then the fight scenes are like manga
Mhm.
visual storytelling. The panel shapes change and that was really influenced one, just wanting that contrast. And then also there was a boxing manga called One Pound Gospel by Rumiko Takahashi
Mhm.
that I read as like an adolescent, that was one of the like initial seeds of this too, is just always being like, there should be more comics about boxing. It looks so cool. So I really looked carefully at that and like how is boxing drawn and when do you use it? It's not intuitive to me to have like triangular panels and things like that. So I had to really kind of look at it. But I like that about this, that it has that stylistic
Mhm.
contrast. Yeah.
And that's one of the cool things about comics is that like you get to play with all these different like um yeah, just these different visual options. It's fun.
Mhm.
So is there anything else you want to share with us about this project? Anything that folks need to know about it?
I guess I'd just say it's really like a labor of love. Like I didn't I really made it out of a deep interest and a belief that this story is our American history and it
Hmm.
calls out a lot of things. It says a lot about American history that we should be talking about. So that was why I made it. It's an earnest project, I would say.
Hmm.
And then it's available on Kickstarter. Well, the first volume's available, and the lofty goal is that it'll help get the second volume done, which will be one big book.
Hmm.
That was where I got stuck, was um being a whitey definitely got in the way of getting a publishing, but also it being two books. I really thought I would release it as two books, and I have talked with a few publishers who are willing to put it out, but they all want one book.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
there's not a lot of investment money to go into that. So I either have to figure out how to make that happen or I have to just move on with my life. I got to figure out if this is as far as it's going to go. And a lot of the cool stuff happens in the second volume. So
Well, see how the first one goes. Like, maybe, yeah, I don't know. I hope that the second volume gets to see the light and that people get to read it. But you've already surpassed your first Kickstarter goal, I believe, right?
Yeah, it's
You've
at
already,
the yeah, it's basically at the break even point, right? I'm not going to lose money sending these books
well,
out.
that's good. um,
It's good for
so
10
yeah,
years of work to break even. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I just want to like encourage people. Obviously, I'm biased because I helped Ryan with this book, but I think there's something for everybody in it, whether you're into sports or American history or just learning about just like a fun biography of this like really dynamic individual. So and give it to your parents, give it to your grandparents, everything. So yeah, just thanks for having me. I'm glad we got to talk about this. Check out Ryan's Kickstarter. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Whit.
Thank you, Ryan.